You know at least 10 people who suffer from psychopathy, but you don't know who they are. How can I be so sure? Statistics. It is estimated that today about 80 million people suffer from psychopathy, about 1% of the world's population. If you are over 20 years old, I am sure you have spoken to at least 5,000 different people in your life, and with at least 1,000 of them, you've exchanged more than just a good morning. Now, among these 1,000 people, about 10 of them suffer from psychopathy, and you probably have no idea who they are. Why is it relevant to know who they are? Because some of these people can be dangerous, very dangerous. In today's video, we will discover together what psychopathy is, how to recognize those who suffer from it, and all the myths and misunderstandings surrounding the subject. The further we go, the more pieces will be added that will help you understand psychopathy better than your arrogant friend who studies psychology. You won't just understand definitions, but will have a complete view of all the most important facets of psychopathy. So, what is psychopathy? Let's start with the etymology. Psycho comes from the Greek psyche, which means soul or mind. Pathy means suffering or disease, so suffering of the soul or disease of the mind. This term was first used in 1888 by the German physician Julius Ludwig August Cooke to describe a pathological character deviation. However, as early as 1801, the French physician Philippe Pinel had described a similar disorder, calling it mania without delirium. In 1941, American psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley published the book The Mask of Sanity, where he outlined the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, describing it as a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, egocentrism, and antisocial behavior. Based on Cleckley's criteria, Canadian psychologist Robert Hare developed the Psychopathy Checklist in 1980, a diagnostic assessment tool for psychopathy. Finally, in 1991, over 100 years after the modern use of the term psychopathy, Robert Hare released the final version of the Psychopathy Checklist known as PCLR, which remains today the fundamental tool used to diagnose those suffering from psychopathy. So, what is the definition of psychopathy? Is it a personality disorder? Is it a mental disorder? Giving the definition of this term is much more complicated than it might seem. You will often hear that psychopathy is a personality disorder. Technically, this is incorrect. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as DSM-5-TR, often referred to as the Bible of Psychiatry, there are only 10 personality disorders listed. Psychopathy is not one of them. Many mistakenly use the term psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder interchangeably, claiming they are the same thing, and that psychopathy is just a more extreme version of the antisocial disorder. Others believe there are many similarities between these two constructs, but technically they are different. Let's first look at antisocial personality disorder. To diagnose it according to the DSM, the individual must present at least 3 or more of these criteria: violation of social norms, deceitfulness and tendency to lie, impulsivity, irritability and aggressiveness, recklessness for one's own or others' safety, consistent irresponsibility, lack of remorse. In addition to the above criteria, the following must also be met. The individual must be at least 18 years old. There must be evidence of conduct disorder before age 15. This disorder includes persistent behaviors such as aggression towards people, torture of animals, bullying, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violation of rules. Moreover, antisocial behaviors must not occur exclusively during schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. These last 3 criteria are neither necessary nor fundamental for the diagnosis of psychopathy. In fact, the individual does not need to be at least 18 years old. There does not need to be a history of conduct disorder before age 15, and it is not crucial whether the individual has episodes of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. In addition to the possible lack of all these character traits, for the diagnosis of psychopathy, there are many other elements not mentioned in antisocial disorder. But don't worry, we will cover them all later in the video. So why do some psychologists mistakenly use the terms psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder? Probably because most people with psychopathy also suffer from antisocial disorder. But be aware that not all people who suffer from antisocial disorder suffer from psychopathy. Although psychopathy cannot technically be defined as a personality disorder, in the latest version of the DSM, it is defined as a distinct variant of antisocial personality disorder and is widely considered a personality disorder by the scientific community. So we too will define it as a personality disorder. Okay, so we know it is a personality disorder and that it has many points in common with antisocial disorder, but we are still far from a complete definition. Be honest, how many times have you heard someone say, "This person is a psychopath," knowing that what they meant was, "This person is crazy"? Psychopath is commonly associated with someone who is out of their mind. Why do people use the term psychopath as a synonym for crazy? Have you ever heard the word psychosis? Even if it's the first time you've heard this word, you can immediately notice that the first 5 letters of psychopath and psychosis are identical. This is likely where this great confusion comes from. But what does psychosis mean? In the field of psychology and psychiatry, the term crazy is not used. In fact, it doesn't exist. But if it did exist, psychosis would probably be the closest word to define it. Psychosis is a mental disorder characterized by a loss of contact with reality. The main symptoms include hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. Another word with the same first 5 identical letters as psychosis and psychopath is psychologist. Even today, too many people associate someone who goes to a psychologist as someone who is out of their mind. In short, if a word starts with psycho, for many it means crazy. The more you continue watching this video, the more you'll understand that a psychopath is anything but crazy. You're probably like me. You believe that psychopaths exist, but of course, you are not one of them, right? Let me tell you the story of James Fallon. This is James. I don't know about you, but I like James. He reminds me of one of those super kind and permissive grandfathers. James was a renowned professor of psychiatry and human behavior at the University of California. In 2005, he was conducting a study on psychopathy using PET and fMRI scans to analyze the brains of psychopathic criminals. During this period, he decided to include some brain scans of his family as a control group. His intention was to compare the brains of criminals with those of normal individuals. One day, while examining the brain scans, Fallon noticed something startling. One of his family's scans showed all the typical characteristics of a psychopathic brain, but he didn't know whose it was. James couldn't identify the person without invalidating the entire study, so initially he did nothing. However, at some point he thought, "I need to know who in my family has this disorder." Thus, he discovered that the person in the family with the psychopathic brain was himself. It is tough to self-diagnose psychopathy correctly, but the more we know about the subject, the higher the chances. That said, would you like to play a game? Choose someone you know well and think might suffer from psychopathy. It could be a friend, a colleague, or a family member. I will ask you a series of questions, and for each question, you will have to give a score from 0 to 2. 0 means the trait or behavior described is absent. 1 means a partial presence of the trait or behavior described. 2 means a significant presence of the trait or behavior described. Ready? Is the person talkative, charming, and capable of making a good first impression on others? Does the person have exaggerated self-esteem and a sense of superiority? Does the person have a constant need for stimulation and get bored easily? Does the person tend to lie continuously without an apparent reason? Is the person considered cunning and skilled at deceiving others? Does the person lack remorse or guilt for their actions? Does the person have superficial emotions and relationships? Is the person insensitive and unable to feel empathy towards others? Does the person tend to exploit others to satisfy their own needs without taking responsibility or contributing productively? Does the person have poor self-control? Does the person have multiple sexual partners indiscriminately without establishing meaningful relationships? Has the person had behavioral problems since childhood? Does the person lack motivation and commitment to achieve long-term goals? Does the person act impulsively without considering the consequences? Is the person irresponsible? Does the person have difficulty accepting responsibility for their actions? Has the person had numerous relationships that lasted for short periods? Has the person had trouble with the law when young? Has the person had parole revoked in the past? Has the person committed a variety of crimes and criminal behaviors? Great. Now that you've answered all these questions, add up all the numbers you wrote down. Before finding out what this number means, write in the comments the number you got. A score from 0 to 8 indicates the absence of significant psychopathic traits. A score from 9 to 17 represents a range where there are some psychopathic traits, but they are not predominant. A score above 18 indicates a high probability of psychopathy. A score of 25 and above in Europe is considered clinically diagnosable as a psychopathy disorder. In the United States, however, diagnosing psychopathy requires a score of at least 30 points out of 40. To give you some point of reference, this is Ted. Ted scored an almost perfect score of 39 out of 40. For those who don't know him, Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers of the modern era. He has been confirmed to have killed over 30 women, and it is speculated that the number might even exceed 100. The strategy he most often used to lure his victims was to pretend to be injured, using crutches and asking for help, then abducting, raping, and killing them. But exactly where does this score come from? It comes from the list of 20 characteristics on the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which is today the most widely used clinical assessment tool for diagnosing psychopathy. Technically, the list is this one. I have slightly modified it and put it in understandable question form. Be aware that the score you obtained earlier should be considered for informational and recreational purposes only. The result has no clinical validity. In fact, to be considered valid, the test must be conducted by a psychologist or psychiatrist. The test must be conducted as a semi-structured interview lasting about 2 hours, followed by a comprehensive review of the individual's personal, criminal, and psychiatric history, using information from medical records, police reports, and interviews with family members. As you may have noticed, it is true that from a score of 25 or 30, the presence of psychopathy can be defined, but there are also lower levels. In the past, you either had psychopathy or you didn't. Today, however, it is seen as a spectrum. There are different shades and levels of psychopathy. As we have seen, the 20 items on the psychopathy checklist are not sufficient for a diagnosis. Other tools and information are needed. So there are additional characteristics beyond those we have just seen that are considered associated with psychopathy, and we will see them shortly. I just mentioned Ted Bundy, a ruthless killer, but there are many other serial killers who have been diagnosed with psychopathy. The presence of so many psychopaths among serial killers has led people to believe that all psychopaths are killers, or at the very least, violent. This, however, is not true. In his book, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us, Hare estimated that between 15 and 25% of the prison population can be classified as psychopathic. A very high percentage, but not all who suffer from psychopathy are violent, and I will tell you more. Some of them can be productive members of society. Consider, for example, Jason Fowler, the professor of psychiatry mentioned above. In the book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Kevin Dutton tries to explore the characteristics of psychopathy and how these can be advantageous in certain professional fields. After a series of research and interviews, he compiled a list of the 10 job types with the highest presence of psychopaths. At number 10, we find the public official. In 9th place, the chef. In 8th place is someone you would never expect, namely the clergy, such as a pastor and priest. In 7th place is the police officer. In 6th place, the journalist. In 5th place is the surgeon. In 4th place is the salesperson. In 3rd place are those working in media, specifically TV and radio. In 2nd place is the lawyer. And in 1st place, the CEO of a company. Why can some psychopathic traits be advantageous in these roles? Many of these jobs often require traits such as charisma, lack of empathy, and the ability to make difficult decisions without emotional involvement. A lawyer defending a person accused of murder must be able to detach from the crime committed by their client and do their best to defend them. The same goes for the surgeon, who must not panic during an operation. Moreover, they must develop the ability to accept that several patients will die under their supervision, something that is extremely debilitating for many doctors. That said, be careful. The fact that they are or seem good at their jobs does not mean they cannot harm people. A striking example of our times is Bernie Madoff, a psychopathic individual who was never violent or convicted of violent crimes. As a billionaire CEO, initially considered a luminary, he turned out to be the greatest fraudster of modern times, ruining thousands of families. We have seen that CEOs of companies are the ones most likely to have psychopathic traits, but how much more likely? In a study conducted by Newman and colleagues, they found that approximately 4% of business executives exhibit significant significant psychopathic traits. This means 1 in 20 individuals. I promised you that we would explore all the additional characteristics considered associated with psychopathy. Additionally, for greater completeness, I will provide some specific explanations for certain points we have covered in the checklist. Let's start. If you had a cat or a dog, would you ever entertain the idea of cutting off your pet's tail to see how it reacts? A hypothetical situation where you would see the animal suffering significantly, hearing its screams of pain. Probably not, or at least I couldn't do it. It breaks my heart when I accidentally step on my cat's tail, let alone cut it off. Paul Frick, a psychologist who has worked for over 20 years studying the risk factors of psychopathy in children, recounts a story of a child who used a knife to cut off the family cat's tail. But the child did not cut off the tail all at once. Instead, he did it piece by piece over a period of several weeks. When the child was asked why he did this to the cat, he proudly responded, "I want to become a scientist, and I was conducting an experiment. I wanted to see how the cat would react." Causing that pain to the cat not only did not trigger any remorse or regret in the child, but it actually gave him pleasure. Another tendency that psychopaths may exhibit is deriving pleasure from causing harm to others. Psychopaths tend to have a smaller and less active amygdala compared to healthy individuals. Thus, the perception of certain emotions, such as fear, anxiety, and stress, is significantly reduced. If one experiences less fear, there is a tendency to take more risks. On the flip side, boredom becomes a rather prevalent emotion. Feeling fewer certain emotions creates a need for more stimuli to experience what a healthy person feels. This explains why individuals with this disorder are in constant search of stimulation. Hence, it is very common for them to abuse drugs and alcohol. This condition also explains their inability to learn from punishment. What happens when you are a child and do something dangerous or hurt your little brother? Your parents give you negative feedback, scold you, and put you in timeout. When this happens, the child records that interaction and experiences an unpleasant feeling inside, leading to the following association: I punched my brother, I was scolded, I feel a bad sensation, so it's better not to punch my brother again. This process happens for years, sometimes multiple times a day, until the lessons learned through this process build our moral code. For some strange reason, if we think about going to a store and stealing something, the mere thought triggers a set of unpleasant emotions within us that prevent us from doing it. Where do these emotions come from? Clearly, someone taught us from a young age that stealing is wrong. Unfortunately for psychopaths, this natural process is compromised. They cannot learn from punishment. The association, I do something bad, I get punished, so I don't do it again, does not exist. A concrete and practical demonstration of their inability to learn from punishment is found in recidivism data. After a prisoner has served their sentence and is released, there is a 300% greater chance that the prisoner will commit the same crime again if they suffer from psychopathy. Now, I will ask you 3 questions, and I would like you to answer as honestly as possible. You will need to make decisions and tell me what the right decision is. 1. There are 8 people tied to the tracks of a train. The train is about to run them over, and they will all surely die unless you do something. Your only option is to push an extremely old and obese woman onto the tracks to derail the train and save the 8 people. Do you save the lives of the 8 people by killing the woman, or do you let the woman live, condemning the 8 people to the tracks? 2. There is a truck heading towards a person you don't know. If you do nothing, the person will die. However, if you put a penny into a machine, this person will survive. Would you use that penny to save their life? 3. You, your wife, and your 3 children are hiding in the basement. 20 seconds from your home, 10 soldiers looking for survivors want to kill you all. 2 of your children are old enough to understand when you tell them to be quiet, but 1 is a newborn who continues to cry loudly. Covering his mouth is not enough. He still makes too much noise. You have only one option left: smother your newborn baby or leave him alive and condemn everyone to death. At least 2 of these questions should evoke a profound internal discomfort. It's terrible to have to make such decisions. It's horrifying to choose whether to kill your newborn baby to save the others and yourself. It's horrifying to choose whether to kill an innocent person to save 8. These fall into the category called moral dilemmas, where there is no single correct solution, but all given solutions are not right. Well, all except for the truck scenario. To answer these questions honestly, a healthy person would experience a strong internal conflict. A psychopath would have no such conflict. When faced with similar decisions, there are 2 parts of our brain. The first is the rational one. The rational part, provided there are no legal repercussions, would push the obese woman onto the tracks. After all, 8 lives are worth more than 1. Moreover, the woman would soon person die due to her obesity and old age. The same applies to the baby. The most sensible thing to do is to suffocate him. If you don't, everyone dies, including the baby. If you do, no one dies except the newborn. In both cases, the child dies, and only in one, 4 people are saved. These are the reasonings that our rational part would make. However, there is also a second part of our brain, the emotional one, that shudders as soon as it hears these kinds of reasoning. The psychopath does not have this part that shudders, so they have no internal conflict. We might call them cold-blooded. Do you remember when we talked about Ted Bundy? Immediately after his arrest, he told the police, "I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch that you will ever meet." A psychopath has such reduced emotional responses, like anxiety, stress, and fear, that they would pass a polygraph test without any issues, regardless of their answers. This also makes them incredibly skilled in lying and manipulating others. We've all lied at least once in our lives, and have been caught in the act at least once. What did you feel when you were caught lying? Guilt? Shame? Well, a psychopath feels none of that. For them, being caught lying feels no different than being caught telling the truth. Nothing changes, and they don't care in the slightest. Their skill in lying and manipulating, using their charisma, is so high that the study The Criminal Psychopath by Keel and colleagues found that psychopathic subjects are 250% more likely to obtain parole compared to non-psychopaths. For those who don't know, to obtain parole, in many cases, you not only have to convince a judge, but also a psychologist who conducts an in-depth analysis to determine if you are still dangerous, if you have changed, and if you give the impression that you will not repeat the same mistakes. They can deceive judges and psychologists masterfully. Thus, not only do they have the highest recidivism rate, but they are also the ones most likely to get out early to commit the same crimes again. At the beginning of this video, we saw that there are many similarities between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. However, there is another personality disorder that shares several common points. I will tell you more. It is estimated that about 30% of those with psychopathy also suffer from this disorder. The disorder in question is narcissistic personality disorder. However, there are substantial differences that distinguish mere narcissism from a psychopath with narcissistic disorder. A narcissist cares a lot about other people's opinions. When they receive negative feedback or criticism, they pull up their shield of arrogance. The purpose of arrogance is to protect all their insecurities and weaknesses. They may try to make you believe that they don't care at all about what you think, but deep down, they care a lot. A psychopath, on the other hand, genuinely does not care what you think of them. We mentioned earlier that a psychopath feels no shame, whereas a narcissist does, but not for conventional reasons. A narcissist may feel shame and remorse, not because they have empathy for a person they have hurt, but because what they did might put them in a bad light in front of others. Both use charisma and charm, but for two very distinct reasons. A narcissist uses it for validation. They want to be validated and liked. A psychopath has no interest in being admired or liked. They use charm and charisma only if it serves their purpose. They are not always charismatic, but if they need to scam you or get you to open your door so they can rob you, they can become charismatic. Now, let's look at some of the most common myths about psychopathy that we haven't mentioned yet. Psychopaths don't feel emotions. This is false. As we've seen, psychopaths do feel emotions. Some, like fear, are significantly reduced, and some, like shame and guilt, are completely absent. But they are not emotionless human beings. Even though other emotions are also reduced in intensity compared to a healthy person, they can still feel boredom, happiness, excitement, sadness, and so on. Psychopaths are not expressive. They always have a serious face and never smile. I want to address this false myth with a photo. However, there is a small note to make. A study by Martian colleagues found a reduction in emotional expressiveness compared to non-psychopathic subjects. However, depending on the context and their needs, they can use facial expressions very effectively. If they need to charm a jury or make you feel comfortable before killing you, they know how to use their expressions. You can recognize a psychopath by their eyes, or at least you can tell if you pay close attention. Some victims and acquaintances of psychopathic individuals say that looking into a psychopath's eyes is like looking into a reptile's eyes. Indifferent to the situation, their eyes remain the same, empty, cold, and detached. This belief is common and might have some merit. Indeed, if you live long enough with a psychopath, you might notice the moment they stop acting, stop smiling, and become completely expressionless. That said, the chances of recognizing a psychopath by their gaze are close to zero. They are very skilled at using their body and expressions to blend in. They are great manipulators. Let's test my theory. Watch this video.
Think you can spot the psychopath? To answer that question, I've gathered these 11 people. 10 of them are normal, but one of them is a psychopath.
My name is Eli.
Hey, I'm Jay.
And I'm not.
I am not.
And I am not.
A psychopath.
Who among these 9 people do you think is a psychopath? Later in the video, I will reveal which of these 9 characters is a psychopath. I want to give you a hint already though. It's probably none of the women. Why? Because it is estimated that the prevalence of psychopathy in men is about 3 times higher than in women. A psychopath can fall in love and feel emotional affection for someone other than themselves. Unfortunately, this is also not true. A psychopath can have a boyfriend or girlfriend and can even get married, but they do not feel the emotion of love as we know it. To love means to sacrifice, to feel emotional empathy, and to sometimes put the other person's interests before our own, something a psychopath could never do. However, a psychopath can feel a strong sexual attraction and can make you believe they love you. That's for sure. An example that made me understand how they cannot feel this type of affection is this. Imagine you lose a brother, your mother, or your wife. Would you go to the funeral? The answer is obviously yes. What a psychopath would do is find an excuse not to go. Not because they suffer too much, but because the funeral is boring and they found a party where they can have fun. Now that we have a very well-defined picture of all the characteristics of psychopathy, 2 spontaneous questions arise. Are you born a psychopath or do you become one? And can psychopathy be cured? Many psychopaths come from healthy and normal family situations without abuse. In early studies conducted by psychologist Hare, it was shown that there were no differences between criminal and non-criminal psychopaths in their family histories. Later, in 2006, Hare and Newman found some correlations. They found that psychopaths who come from low socioeconomic environments had a higher tendency to develop a more severe form of psychopathy. So, how significant is the environmental part compared to the genetic one? In the 2005 study by Whiting and colleagues called Evidence for Substantial Genetic Risk for Psychopathy in 7-year-olds, it was discovered that in monozygotic twins who have the same genetic material, if one of the twins has psychopathic traits, it is very likely that the other twin will have them too. However, someone might say, how can we be sure it's not an environmental issue since the twins are born and raised together in the same family? Well, the study also conducted the same research with dizygotic twins, who share only 50% of their genetic material. What they found is that if a dizygotic twin is psychopathic, the probability that the other twin is also psychopathic is significantly lower than for the monozygotic twins. Researchers estimate that about 70% of psychopathic traits are inheritable, meaning they are genetically transmitted. So psychopaths tend to have a set of genes that increases the likelihood of developing a psychopathic brain. These genetic and brain structure modifications then come into contact with the environment to transform the person into either a criminal or non-criminal psychopath. So are you born a psychopath or do you become one? The answer is both, but the genetic part is the most predominant. Can psychopathy be cured? If psychopathy has a significant genetic prevalence, can we modify the genes that lead to psychopathy? Theoretically, yes. In practice, it is still something far-fetched. Unfortunately, there is not a single gene that leads to psychopathy, but dozens of possible genes, and there could be others that we have not yet discovered. Moreover, we do not yet have the medical expertise to remove all these genes. Okay, with genetics, we can't do anything yet, but could we focus on training to develop greater empathy? If we could make these people feel empathy, many of their other problematic characteristics could lessen, transforming them into healthier individuals. Empathy can be trained. Behaviors can be changed. In theory, all this is possible. There is just one small, huge problem. The psychopath should want to do it, but they don't want to do it because they genuinely do not believe that there is anything wrong with them, or that they need to change. On the contrary, having empathy, guilt, or remorse are just elements of weakness, which they themselves use against others. So changing behavior and trying to become more empathetic would mean becoming weaker and more vulnerable, the exact opposite of what someone with psychopathy aims to be. However, you might have an objection to this point. We said that those with psychopathy cannot feel empathy, which is true, but not entirely correct. We can divide empathy into 2 categories: emotional empathy and cognitive cognitive empathy. In emotional empathy, the subject understands and even feels emotions similar to the person in front of them. This is the type of empathy that the psychopath cannot feel, not even with training. Then there is the second type of empathy, cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand others' perspectives and emotions without necessarily sharing those emotions. This can be trained. The problem, once again, in this case, is not so much the ability to develop this cognitive empathy, but rather how they use it. If the psychopath develops this skill and does not have a moral compass, they will use it as an additional tool to manipulate and get what they want. The only remaining element to work on is the environment. The environment in which a psychopath is born and raised seems to be the only significant element with which one can attempt to raise a psychopath in a way that they do not become a dysfunctional person for themselves and others. There are two main problems. The first is that even if you are born into a family without abuse that gives you love and is present for you, unfortunately, the individual could still develop dysfunctional behaviors. The second is the difficulty. In theory, parents should develop the ability to recognize the first psychopathic traits in their child, learn how to best treat them, take them to therapy, undergo therapy themselves, and instill in them a functional desire. There is a significant presence of non-criminal psychopaths in society who are lawyers, surgeons, chefs, or CEOs. The idea of helping and considering others must become a tool that encourages psychopaths to voluntarily choose to develop functional behaviors for society. This approach is more effective than coercive or punitive methods. If psychopaths understand that behaving pro-socially and altruistically can be greatly beneficial to themselves, they are more likely to repeat such behaviors even as adults. Finally, there is one last possibility, which is more of a characteristic. It has been noted that as years go by, when a psychopath ages, they tend to calm down more and reduce all of those harmful practices for others. This effect is called psychopathic burnout. Something is missing. I feel that something very important is still missing. But what? Of course. Nowadays, there is a term that people use much more frequently than the term psychopath to describe a person with psychopathic traits. This term is sociopath. The question naturally arises, do sociopath and psychopath mean the same thing, or are there substantial differences? Both sociopathy and psychopathy represent conditions characterized by significant difficulties in relating to others and following social norms. However, the distinction between the two terms is debated among experts, and there is no unanimous consensus. The term sociopathy is not officially recognized in modern psychiatry, and many professionals prefer to use the term antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. Some consider sociopathy as a less severe form of psychopathy or a variant of psychopathy, while others believe the two terms mean the same thing. The opinions on the distinction between sociopathy and psychopathy can be summarized as follows: impulsivity versus calculation. Sociopaths are believed to be more impulsive and tend to react emotionally, while psychopaths are considered more calculating and cold in their behaviors. Social integration. Psychopaths often manage to mask their disorder better, integrating better into society and maintaining a facade of normality. Sociopaths, on the other hand, tend to be less organized and create more tumultuous relationships. Origin of the disorder. Psychopathy has a predominant genetic component, while sociopathy might derive more from environmental and developmental factors. Consider a practical example. If a colleague criticizes the work of two people, one sociopathic and one psychopathic, both would react very differently. The sociopath might immediately confront the colleague, raise their voice, or even resort to violence. In contrast, the psychopath would show no immediate emotional reaction, but might plan revenge that would manifest itself months later. For instance, they might put drugs in their colleague's car and then make an anonymous call to the police. Well, we have reached the last and perhaps most important point of this video. What to do if you think someone is a psychopath. Addressing how to deal with a person you suspect might be a psychopath requires both philosophical and moral reflection. How should we treat someone who could potentially become a criminal or a murderer? Is it right to treat them as if they already are? It is crucial to judge people based on their actions rather than what they might do. There are psychopaths who live functionally within society, maintaining their characteristics without becoming criminals. If you sense something odd about a person, it is more useful to focus on their behaviors rather than on potential clinical diagnosis. Would you trust someone who has blatantly lied to you or shows no remorse? Probably not. It is important to remember that people are not defined by their diagnosis. Someone suffering from autism is not autistic, just as someone with cancer is not the cancer. The same goes for psychopathy. I have often used the term psychopath because it is widely used and known in common parlance, but I strongly advise against using it to describe someone. Not only is it not a technical term, but it also confuses the disorder with the person, which are two distinct things. If you suspect that someone might exhibit psychopathic traits, it is wise to remain vigilant. However, treating this person as a criminal based solely on suspicions would be ignorant. It makes more sense to decide how to act based on observed behaviors. The dynamics and complexity vary depending on the type of relationship you have with this person. Whether it's a parent, friend, partner, colleague, child, or superior, each relationship presents unique dynamics. In complex situations, it might be helpful to consider a coach or psychologist for support. Remember that everything a person with psychopathic traits says might be false or distorted. Do not trust them as readily as you would a friend. In many situations, your relationship with this person can remain strictly transactional. Both of you might use each other for your own purposes, and recognizing this is fundamental. Consider that a person with psychopathic traits might not be able to empathize with you, and probably doesn't genuinely care about you as a friend, partner, or employer. If, for instance, you discover that an employee or colleague of yours constantly lies or tries to make you look ridiculous, you might decide to distance yourself from this person. It is important to distinguish between lies of varying severity. The lie, "I can't go out for coffee because something came up," can be considered a circumstantial lie, common to many of us. These lies are not necessarily indicative of psychopathy, but may stem from the fear of hurting someone or rejecting an invitation. On the other hand, more serious lies, such as those concerning infidelity or taking credit for work that is not theirs, require more careful evaluation. In such cases, regardless of the possibility that the other person suffers from psychopathy, it might be wise to cut ties. Did you really get this far? Congratulations! As promised, I will now reveal which of the 9 characters has the psychopathic disorder. Let me know in the comments if you guessed correctly. It was him. We have discussed the differences between psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. The latter two are just 2 of the 10 existing personality disorders. If it is estimated that about 1% of the world's population suffers from psychopathy, it is also estimated that between 5 and 10% of the same population suffers from at least one personality disorder. In the description, you can find the video where I explain all these personality disorders in just 10 minutes.